The story of the Heinkel He-72. Kadett began in 1933, right in the middle of Germany's massive aviation revival. Once the Nazi Party came to power, the country began openly ignoring the strict limitations of the Treaty of Versailles. They did this by rapidly expanding ostensibly civilian flying clubs like the National Socialist Flyers Corps. These groups desperately needed affordable aircraft that could be mass-produced. Their primary goal was basic flight training. They were secretly building a pool of pilots for the future Luftwaffe. Ernst Heinkel's company took on the project, aiming to win a government contract. They wanted to build the perfect primary trainer. It had to be something incredibly simple and cheap to operate. This would supply both the flying clubs and the early units of their clandestine air force. The design requirements were straightforward and practical. It had to be a two-seat, open-cockpit biplane capable of aerobatics. The main focus was making the aircraft gentle and easy to fly, even for student pilots with zero flight time. Plus, the airframe had to be rugged enough to handle the abuse of constant daily flying without needing heavy maintenance. The spec called for a top speed of around 112 miles per hour, or about 180 kilometers per hour. Up front, they planned to mount a readily available radial engine. A good example was the Siemens Halske SH-14A, producing 160 horsepower. Reliability was far more important than setting any speed records. They designed the fuselage and wing structures using welded steel tubing covered in doped fabric. This kept the aircraft light but extremely tough. It was ideal for short takeoffs and landings on the rough grass strips where the cadets did their primary training. These specs perfectly aligned with the overall strategy of the Reich Air Ministry at the time. They needed to establish mass production without relying on strategic materials or overly complex components. They deliberately kept the design free of any intricate engineering. This ensured the aircraft could be assembled quickly and repaired easily in the field. It could even be done by semi-skilled labor. The whole approach captured the mindset of the era. It was a time when Germany's aviation infrastructure had to scale up as fast as humanly possible. Construction and testing of the first He-72. Kadett prototypes kicked off that same year at the Heinkel plant. The first prototype was built as a conventional biplane. It featured mixed construction. This utilized a blend of steel tubing and wood with the entire airframe covered in fabric. The aircraft was powered by an inverted inline Argus AS-8B engine. It produced 140 horsepower. It was chosen specifically because it was an ideal match for a lightweight trainer. The prototype took to the skies for its maiden flight later that year. Once in the air, the design proved to be stable. The handling was docile and predictable enough for cadets taking their very first steps in aviation. During flight testing, the engineers focused heavily on the aircraft's low-speed handling. They also looked closely at its stall recovery characteristics and just how forgiving it would be of student pilot errors. The prototype delivered solid results, though it definitely had its quirks. For instance, the entire airframe suffered from noticeable vibration in flight. Thanks to this trait, the aircraft earned the nickname Zitterrocken. This is German for electric ray. It served as a clever pun on its trembling airframe. Of course, after the initial tests, a process of continuous refinement began. Because the early prototypes were a bit underpowered, the first production versions, like the He-72A, were fitted with a more powerful engine. This was the 150 horsepower Argus AS-8R. Further flight tests confirmed that the aircraft met the military's strict requirements for a primary trainer. This paved the way for new variants. For example, the He-72B was powered by a 160 horsepower Siemens Halske SH-14A engine. This significantly improved reliability and climb rate during the next round of flight testing. Throughout the entire flight test program, there was not a single major structural failure. Switching to new engine types was simply a logical response to test pilot feedback. The production run of the Heinkel He-72 trainer began with the baseline He-72A variant. Initially, these aircraft were powered by a 140 horsepower, air-cooled inline Argus AS-8B engine. Later, to give the aircraft a bit more power without requiring major airframe modifications, they transitioned to the upgraded 150 horsepower AS-8R engine. But that setup was short-lived. For the definitive production variant designated the HE-72B, engineers switched to a 160 horsepower, 7-cylinder Siemens SH-14A radial engine. This move massively boosted the aircraft's reliability. This was absolutely crucial for the high tempo of flight training. This engine swap ironed out the initial production issues. It allowed the aircraft to become the standard primary trainer for both Luftwaffe cadets and civilian flight schools. Moving forward, they continued to refine the airframe for specific missions and customer requirements. This led to the military HE-72B1 variant with standard wheeled landing gear, as well as the lightweight HE-72B2. For the civilian market, they developed the HE-72B3 Edel Kadett. This translates from German as Noble Cadet. It was designed for aerial touring and advanced training. It even featured a dedicated baggage compartment right behind the cockpit. In total, they built about 30 of these aircraft for the civilian market. On top of that, there was a float plane version designated the HE-72BW Sea Kadett, or Sea Cadet. This version swapped the wheeled landing gear for twin floats for water operations. Meanwhile, the HE-72C variant stood out from its predecessors. It featured upgraded landing gear and a much more comfortable cockpit. The aircraft also found success in the export market. For instance, in the late 1930s, the Slovak Air Force took delivery of 30 airframes. These were exported under the designation HE-72D. In 1934, engineers used the HE-72B airframe as a test bed to build the experimental HE-172 prototype. It was used to test a new NACA-style aerodynamic engine cowling. But this specific configuration never made it into full production. It was an era of constant experimentation and aerodynamic refinement. Overall, the aircraft was produced in significant numbers, both for domestic training squadrons and for export. It is impossible to pin down the exact production numbers today since many of the historical records were destroyed. Ultimately, the numerous variants were just a pragmatic response from the designers to test pilot feedback. They needed more power and versatility, not fixes for underlying design flaws. When it comes to its design, the Heinkel HE-72 Kadett trainer featured a classic mixed construction. The airframe was built from both metal and wooden components. It was covered in doped fabric, which protected the aircraft from the elements, smoothed out the aerodynamics, and most importantly kept manufacturing and maintenance costs down for a basic trainer. The fuselage had a rectangular cross-section. Its wooden structural framework was reinforced by metal fittings. Inside, it featured two open cockpits. They were arranged in tandem for the student and instructor. The cockpits were separated by a bulkhead. This allowed for a straightforward dual control setup. It also preserved decent forward visibility for both pilots. The wings featured a conventional biplane configuration. The upper and lower wings had a slight stagger. They were braced by sturdy end struts on either side. This created a highly rigid box structure. They eliminated the need for extra cabane struts directly over the fuselage. This cut down on drag and gave the pilots a much cleaner field of view. The upper wingspan measured just under 29.5 feet. It had a total wing area of roughly 223 square feet. Under the skin, the wings relied on a fabric-covered wooden framework. This was reinforced with metal tubing. Thanks to this well-thought-out design, the airplane was remarkably forgiving. It remained stable when student pilots were first learning basic aerobatics. The tail section of the aircraft was fairly conventional. The horizontal stabilizer and vertical fin were wooden structures braced with wire. This allowed ground crews to easily adjust the angle of incidence during maintenance. Out back, it relied on a fixed metal tail skid for taxiing. The main landing gear was fixed. The main wheels sat on tough V-struts. They were equipped with oleo shock absorbers. This gear setup was well suited to soaking up hard landings. It worked well on the rough, unimproved dirt and grass strips typically used by aero clubs. As mentioned earlier, the HE-72B version sat on standard wheels. Meanwhile, the naval HE-72BW variant swapped the wheeled gear for a pair of large twin floats. This meant they could train seaplane pilots without having to heavily alter the basic airframe. The beating heart of the Heinkel HE-72 Kadett was a reliable air-cooled radial engine. The most widely produced version of the aircraft was powered by a 7-cylinder Siemens Halske SH-14A engine. It turned out 160 horsepower on takeoff. This engine, which BMW later built under license, had a displacement of 458 cubic inches. That is about 7.5 liters. It was specifically tuned for stable, trouble-free operation at low altitudes. This made it the perfect power plant for teaching beginners the fundamentals of flight. Interestingly, the very first prototype actually flew with a weaker 140 horsepower Argus inline engine. However, the engineers quickly realized that the radial design offered significantly better air cooling. It also produced far less vibration, so it became the production standard. Thrust was provided by a classic 2-blade fixed pitch wooden propeller. It measured just over 7 feet in diameter. It was mounted to the nose of the airplane. This simple setup was completely free of any complex variable pitch mechanisms. It perfectly matched the main goal of the aircraft, which was keeping the trainer as cheap and easy to maintain as possible. Sure, a fixed pitch prop compromised the ability to optimize performance across different airspeeds. But for basic flight training, it was more than enough. The engine spun this prop through a reduction gear. This kept the engine speed in a safe and efficient operating range, right around 2200 RPM. The fuel system was about as simple as it gets. Fuel was gravity-fed to the engine from the main tank, tucked away in the upper wing. There were no complex pumps to confuse student pilots or cause maintenance headaches. The aircraft lacked superchargers or advanced ignition systems. The entire design of the HE-72 prioritized accessibility and incredible ease of operation over high-speed performance. Even the military variants and floatplane versions used this exact same basic Siemens engine. It required only minor propeller adjustments. In the air, the HE-72 was a highly predictable aircraft for its class. With its 160 horsepower engine, the aircraft could hit a top speed of 115 miles per hour. It comfortably cruised between 100 and 105 miles per hour. This depended on payload and weather conditions. Its service ceiling was 11,500 feet. This gave pilots plenty of room for practicing aerobatics, even if high-altitude operations were out of the question. The climb rate was just under 600 feet per minute. This reflected the designer's focus on smooth, forgiving low-speed handling rather than raw performance. Range depended on the configuration. On a standard tank, the aircraft easily covered about 300 miles. But with auxiliary tanks, it could push that out to roughly 500 miles. This impressive reliability and simple design set the stage for a long and eventful operational history. It took the aircraft from civilian flight schools to the first training flights of future aces. In 1933, Heinkel rolled out a new trainer, the HE-72 Kadett. It was purpose-built to teach student pilots the basics of flight in civilian schools. It also served in clandestine training programs for future military aviators. It was an incredibly simple open cockpit biplane of mixed metal and wood construction. This made it an ideal platform for those very first steps into the sky. It was great for practicing basic maneuvers and even entry-level aerobatics. The first production version was designated the HE-72A. It was powered by a 140 horsepower Argus AS-8B inline engine. The aircraft proved to be highly affordable and easy to maintain. As a result, it quickly became a favorite among private owners and aero clubs. It became a real workhorse. It was used for primary flight training and frequently served as a glider tug. Shortly after, Heinkel rolled out a strictly civilian version designated the HE-72B3 Edelkadett. Production was limited to roughly 30 airframes. Tailored for comfortable touring and sport flying, this variant featured a convenient baggage compartment behind the cockpit. It also had aerodynamic wheel spats. Meanwhile, the standard HE-72B models were equipped with a more capable 160 horsepower Siemens SH-14A radial engine. These aircraft saw heavy use for cross-country flights and local airfield training. They flew extensively over Bavaria in the lead-up to the Second World War. However, the most important role of the Kadett was kept strictly off the books. At the time, Germany was working to bypass the strict limitations of the Treaty of Versailles. They were actively building up a paramilitary aviation corps known as the NSFK. Under the guise of civilian aero clubs, they were secretly training the personnel who would form the backbone of their future Air Force. Heinkel delivered 235 airframes to these organizations. An entire generation of pilots earned their wings on the Kadett, well before the Luftwaffe was officially established. This dual role made the Kadett a genuinely important aircraft for its time. It served as the bridge connecting everyday recreational flying with a massive state-sponsored rearmament program. Because of the chaos of the war and lost archives, historians still do not know the exact number of airframes built, but it is believed that several hundred were rolled out by the mid-30s. Of course, the aircraft had its drawbacks. Due to noticeable in-flight vibrations, limited speed, and quirky handling, cadets jokingly nicknamed it the Zitterrochen, the same electric ray nickname the prototype had already earned. Ultimately, these technical limitations meant the aircraft was strictly limited to basic training. It eventually gave way to more advanced trainers. The Heinkel He 72 was originally designed purely for civilian flight training. However, it did not take long for the military to take notice. In Germany during the early 30s, first under the Weimar Republic and later under the Nazi regime, the country was quietly but actively building up its armed forces. This was done to evade international treaties. In 1934, the clandestine aviation branch of the Reichswehr started testing this aircraft for basic pilot training. This led to the first major order of 100 airframes for the German Transport Flyer School, or Deutsche Verkehrsfliegerschule. In reality, this completely civilian-sounding name was just a front for secret military training centers. It was a clever way for the Germans to skirt the strict limits of the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty banned them from having a military air force. When the Nazis came to power in 1933 and the Luftwaffe was officially established in 1935, aircraft production skyrocketed. By 1936, Heinkel had delivered over 300 of these trainers to military flight schools. The aircraft became an absolute staple of the Grundschulung program, meaning basic flight training. The main reason for this success was that the airframe was incredibly forgiving of rookie mistakes. It featured a ridiculously low stall speed of just 34 miles per hour, or about 55 kilometers per hour. Eventually, its integration into the Luftwaffe became official. More advanced training variants of the He 72 started rolling out. These featured some highly practical upgrades like reinforced landing gear. This allowed young cadets to safely take off and land even on rough, unimproved grass strips. By 1937, there were over 2,000 He 72s serving in Luftwaffe aviation schools, known as Fliegerschulen. They made up a fifth of the entire basic trainer fleet. Thanks to these low-maintenance aircraft, Germany was able to massively expand its aircrew. While they only had 1,000 pilots in 1935, by 1939 that number had swelled to over 10,000. The aircraft's simple wooden construction and its reliable 160 horsepower Siemens Halske SH-14A engine made it exceptionally cost-effective for mass production. Luftwaffe leadership heavily favored the aircraft. This pushed even solid competitors like the Bucker Bu-131 into the background. The deciding factor was the sheer manufacturing capacity of the Heinkel factories. They could churn out these airframes at a remarkable rate. However, despite being produced in such huge numbers, the He 72 still had some serious limitations. It was highly susceptible to bad weather and had pretty modest flight characteristics. Its top speed barely reached 115 miles per hour, or roughly 185 kilometers per hour. Because of this, starting in 1938, it was gradually replaced by more capable designs like the Focke-Wulf FW-44. Despite that, the cadets kept reliably carrying out auxiliary duties right up until 1940. According to German records, over 2,000 of these aircraft were built in total, with 80% being military variants. This just goes to show the crucial transitional role this airplane played in training pilots en masse. It helped build up the country's air power under tight resource constraints leading up to the war. How these aircraft actually held up in combat and their wartime limitations, though, that is a whole different story. During World War II, the German He 72 Kadett continued in its primary role. It served as a basic trainer and liaison aircraft for the Luftwaffe. Instead of seeing frontline combat, the Kadett was relegated to the initial training of student pilots deep behind the lines. By 1940, 629 cadets were still in active service. They supported flight school operations, which were based in occupied Czech territory for much of the war. These simple biplanes were a great fit for novices. The open tandem cockpits and simple mixed construction helped cadets master the basics of flight. They could also practice instrument flying and fly liaison missions. Interestingly, production of the type had actually ended back in 1936, but by that point they had already built over 2,000 airframes. This included those manufactured under license at the Fiesler factories. This stockpile was more than enough to keep the Luftwaffe supplied with trainers at the outbreak of the war. However, the wartime utility of the He-72 Kadett was heavily limited by its pre-war design. While German aviation was rapidly transitioning to much faster monoplanes, this aging biplane stayed far away from the front lines. By January 1944, the number of operational airframes had dropped to 417. The main reasons were mechanical wear and tear, inevitable training accidents, and a gradual replacement by more modern trainers like the Bu-131 Jungmann. The heart of the Kadett was typically a 160-horsepower Siemens SH-14. A radial engine, it could only push the airplane to a top speed of 115 miles per hour. This lack of speed made it an incredibly vulnerable target for enemy fighters. It was totally useless for escort or reconnaissance in contested airspace. On top of that, the fixed landing gear and fabric covering made flying in bad weather particularly hazardous. And because of its low payload capacity, the Germans never bothered to equip it with any serious weaponry. It is worth pointing out, however, that the Slovak military actually modified the He-72B1 variant to carry small bombs for light attack roles. All of these inherent limitations were to be expected. The airplane was originally designed for 1930s civilian flight training, not the harsh realities of a world war. By the middle of the conflict, the He-72 Kadett was completely obsolete. Official reports from that time noted that the Luftwaffe needed more reliable aircraft with enclosed cockpits for advanced pilot training. Despite this, its remarkably low maintenance requirements and forgiving flight characteristics allowed the airplane to stay in service for a long time. It kept turning out new aviators in large numbers. This continued until severe fuel and material shortages finally forced the military to ground these trainers. The few surviving airframes lucky enough to make it through World War II found new life. They served in the air forces of Eastern European countries during the post-war years. The different variants of the He-72 Kadett, which translates from German as Kadett, were primarily designed to improve the base model. Engineers wanted to make it more reliable, powerful, and versatile for training future pilots. For the most part, engineers focused on upgrading the power plants and experimenting with different landing gear configurations. The first production version was the He-72A. It was a classic biplane with a fabric-covered metal airframe. Early models were fitted with an inline AS-8B engine putting out 140 horsepower. Later on, to boost performance and improve cooling, they swapped it out. They used an upgraded AS-8R engine delivering 150 horsepower. This specific variant became the standard primary trainer for the Luftwaffe. It held this role at least until more advanced aircraft eventually replaced it. The He-72B became the main and most widely produced variant in the history of the aircraft. Engineers equipped it with a 7-cylinder SH-14A radial engine producing 160 horsepower. This upgrade provided much better torque and made the airplane fully capable of performing aerobatics. The new radial engine successfully resolved the main issues found in earlier versions, particularly the excessive vibration and the constant need for complex maintenance. This series spawned a few interesting variants. For example, the He-72B1 was a standard land plane with wheeled landing gear, well suited for airfield training. The He-72BW Kadett, which translates from German as Sea Cadet, swapped the wheels for twin floats. It was used as a seaplane for coastal and naval aviation training. There was also the He-72B3 Edel Kadett, or Noble Cadet. This was a much more luxurious civilian version intended for sport flying. It featured refined cockpit fittings and upgraded instruments, but they did not build many of these beauties. Only about 30 units ever rolled off the assembly line. Beyond that, the He-72D model was created specifically for the Slovak Air Force. They built 30 of these airplanes, which were used in a light attack role. Despite all these changes, the airplanes kept their classic design with open tandem cockpits and staggered wings. In total, over 2,000 of these aircraft were produced across various series. The main priority remained cost-effectiveness and the ability to mass-produce affordable trainers. Aside from the engine upgrades, other structural changes were kept to an absolute minimum to maintain production simplicity. For instance, to create the BW floatplane version, engineers pretty much only had to reinforce the landing gear struts and attach the floats. Through all of this, the dimensions stayed exactly the same. The aircraft had a wingspan of 29.5 feet and a length of just over 24.5 feet. Thanks to the reliable SH-14A engine, the seaplane could still reach around 105 miles per hour and cover a range of 510 miles on a single tank. They did not outfit these production aircraft with any serious weaponry or combat systems. Their primary mission was always teaching student pilots the basics of flight from the ground up, not fighting on the front lines. The Heinkel He 72 was primarily designed as a basic training aircraft for the National Socialist Flyers Corps. This was the official aviation wing of the Nazi Party, which existed even before the Luftwaffe was fully established in 1935. Heinkel began delivering these biplanes to numerous flight schools starting in 1934. This was the exact aircraft where cadets first took to the skies and practiced basic aerobatics during Germany's rapid rearmament period. These airplanes were highly valued for their straightforward handling and low production costs. Thanks to this accessibility, Germany was able to rapidly train thousands of civilian aviators and transform them into full-fledged military pilots. Once the Luftwaffe was officially established, the He-72 saw widespread use at major flight training centers and reserve schools. The most popular variant was powered by the highly reliable Siemens Halske SH-14A engine. The main job for these aircraft was primary flight training, teaching raw cadets from absolute scratch. The biplane's docile and highly predictable handling characteristics helped inexperienced student pilots safely master the rudder, elevator, and ailerons. Only after completing this basic phase did pilots move on to more advanced trainers like the Bucker Bu-131. Although the last batch of He-72s rolled off the assembly line back in 1936, surviving airframes continued to see heavy use in auxiliary training roles. This continued well into the early years of World War II. Since the aircraft was completely obsolete for combat, it was almost never seen on the front lines. One extremely rare exception was its combat deployment by Slovak forces. They actually flew these light biplanes on ground attack missions during the 1941 campaign. The He-72 also saw some success on the export market. In the late 1930s, the Bulgarian Air Force bought a small batch for basic pilot training. These were integrated into their pre-war programs alongside domestically built trainers. Czechoslovakia also briefly flew the type in their civilian aero clubs. However, after the country was occupied in 1939, the airframes were confiscated and absorbed directly into the Luftwaffe. As the war dragged on, attrition took its toll. Mounting aircraft losses and severe material shortages meant that by 1942, operational use of the He-72 had dropped sharply. Most of the surviving airframes were relegated to glider schools or simply stripped for parts. This was an inevitable progression. As the demands placed on military pilots continued to grow, the Luftwaffe was gradually shifting its training programs over to more modern monoplanes.